On the makeshift runway in the war zone, a group of civilians had just escaped death thanks to an unknown female pilot flying a battered helicopter. As they touched the ground safely, cheers erupted everywhere. Everyone hugged each other and celebrated the person who had saved their lives. But seconds later, the military radio crackled. "This is Raptor One. Identify yourself. Call sign Falcon Eyes." Everyone fell silent, because the F-22s overhead had just solemnly called out that woman's exact name with unmistakable respect. Valeria Torres had spent 3 years trying to disappear into the background of civilian aviation support. At 30 years old, with long brown hair, usually braided back, and a lean frame that made her seem fragile compared to the military pilots around her, she worked as a freelance helicopter pilot, primarily handling supply runs and occasional civilian evacuations. To the military personnel she occasionally worked with, civilian contract pilots were necessary, but unremarkable support staff. They handled routine transportation tasks, while the real aviators, the military pilots with official training and prestigious assignments, dealt with the important missions. "She's just an air taxi driver," a young airman would joke when other personnel asked about the quiet woman who maintained an old civilian helicopter at the edge of the airfield. "Not a real combat pilot, just someone who flies people around when they need a ride." Another soldier would laugh and add, "Yeah, that beat-up helicopter of hers looks like it's held together with duct tape and prayers. I wouldn't trust it to carry my luggage, let alone fly through hostile territory." These comments never seemed to bother Valeria. She would simply continue her work with quiet efficiency, performing meticulous maintenance on her aging helicopter, ensuring that every system was functioning properly despite the aircraft's worn appearance. But Valeria's approach to her civilian aviation work was different from other contract pilots. She would often volunteer for the most dangerous missions: evacuations from hostile areas, supply runs to isolated outposts, transportation for personnel who needed to reach dangerous locations quickly. Her flying skills were extraordinary, but she downplayed them whenever anyone commented. She could navigate through terrible weather conditions, land in impossible terrain, and maintain aircraft performance under conditions that would challenge far more experienced pilots. "Strange for a civilian pilot to be so comfortable with high-risk missions," Chief Warrant Officer Martinez commented to his colleague, while watching Valeria perform what appeared to be a perfect landing in crosswind conditions that had grounded other aircraft. "She handles that helicopter like she's been flying in combat zones for years." "Maybe she's just desperate for work," his colleague replied. "Civilian aviation is competitive. She probably takes the dangerous jobs because no one else wants them." Hidden beneath her civilian flight suit, worn close to her skin where no casual observer would see it, was a silver bracelet with an inscription that would have shocked anyone who discovered it. "Kraken Unit, Falcon Eyes." During her downtime between missions, Valeria would often position herself where she could observe military flight operations. She would watch pilots perform takeoffs and landings, listen to radio communications, and study tactical procedures with an intensity that seemed unusual for someone whose work was supposedly limited to civilian transportation. "Why does she pay so much attention to military operations?" one pilot asked another while noting Valeria's consistent presence during training exercises. "Contract pilots don't need to understand combat procedures." Late at night, when the airfield was quiet, Valeria would sometimes sit beside her helicopter and perform maintenance tasks that went far beyond routine civilian requirements. She would test systems, calibrate instruments, and ensure readiness standards that seemed excessive for supply run operations. During one of these evening maintenance sessions, a young boy from a nearby refugee camp approached her. He had been watching her work and was curious about the helicopter that looked so different from the sleek military aircraft. "Ma'am, why do you spend so much time working on your helicopter? The other pilots just gas up and go." Valeria looked up from the engine components she was inspecting, her eyes showing a depth that seemed at odds with her civilian contractor status. "Because every flight might be someone's only chance to get home safely. I need to be ready for anything." The boy didn't fully understand her answer, but he sensed that she was talking about more than routine maintenance. Later, that boy would say, "When I was scared during the bombing, she knelt down and whispered, 'Falcons never abandon the ground.' I didn't understand it then, but I never forgot those words or the way she said them." The crisis began when a small village became trapped between advancing terrorist forces and difficult terrain that made conventional rescue operations nearly impossible. Intelligence reports indicated that approximately 40 civilians, including women and children, were surrounded and facing imminent danger. The military response was swift but complicated. The village's location made it accessible only by helicopter, but the approach routes were heavily defended by enemy forces with anti-aircraft weapons. Several pilots had already declined the mission as too dangerous for the potential success rate. "This is a suicide mission," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes announced during the emergency briefing. "The approach route requires flying through established kill zones, and the landing area is completely exposed to enemy fire. We need volunteers, but I want everyone to understand the risks." When no military pilots immediately volunteered for what appeared to be a nearly impossible rescue operation, Valeria stepped forward from where she had been observing the briefing. "Sir, I volunteer to fly the evacuation mission. My helicopter can handle the terrain requirements, and I'm willing to accept the risks." The reaction in the briefing room was immediate and dismissive. Lieutenant Peters actually laughed out loud. "Ma'am, this isn't a supply run to a friendly outpost. This is a combat evacuation through hostile territory with active anti-aircraft threats." Other personnel joined in the skeptical response. "She's a civilian contractor," added Captain Rodriguez. "She doesn't have training for combat operations or experience with hostile fire. This mission requires military pilots with combat experience." Colonel Hayes looked at Valeria with obvious doubt. "Torres, I appreciate your willingness to help, but this operation requires skills and experience that civilian pilots don't typically possess. The approach alone will require tactical flying through multiple threat zones. Besides," Lieutenant Peters continued, "that helicopter of yours looks like it's ready for the scrapyard. We need reliable aircraft for a mission this critical, not something held together with spare parts." But Valeria had already made her decision. While the military personnel continued debating pilot assignments and tactical approaches, she quietly left the briefing room and began preparing her helicopter for immediate departure. As she performed her pre-flight inspection, Chief Martinez noticed her systematic approach to aircraft preparation. Her movements were precise, professional, and much more thorough than typical civilian procedures. "That's not how a civilian pilot prepares for flight," he said to himself, recognizing inspection patterns that he had only seen from highly trained military aviators. When Valeria started her helicopter engines, the sound drew attention from across the airfield. Instead of the rough, irregular noise of an old civilian aircraft, the engine ran with the smooth precision of a perfectly maintained military machine. "How is a beat-up civilian helicopter running that smoothly?" asked Sergeant Williams, listening to engine performance that didn't match the aircraft's worn appearance. As Valeria lifted off without official authorization, heading directly toward the hostile territory where the civilians were trapped, Martinez noticed something else that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about their quiet contract pilot. Her takeoff technique was flawless, not the cautious, gradual ascent of a civilian pilot, but the confident, tactical departure of someone trained for combat operations. She was using flight patterns designed to minimize radar signature and reduce vulnerability to ground fire. "Chief, that's not civilian flying," Martinez said to his colleague. "That's tactical aviation, military-grade technique." Radio communications crackled as air traffic control tried to contact the unauthorized aircraft. "Civilian helicopter heading 270. You are not cleared for flight in that vector. Return to base immediately." Valeria's response was professional but determined. "Control, this is rescue flight. Proceeding to extract civilians from hostile area. Will maintain radio contact." 20 minutes later, reports began coming in from ground observers near the village. A helicopter had appeared over the hostile territory, but instead of being shot down by the extensive anti-aircraft defenses, It was maneuvering through the threat environment with remarkable skill. Unknown helicopter is using tactical flight patterns to avoid surface-to-air threats, reported a forward observer. Pilot is demonstrating advanced evasion techniques and precision flying under fire. As Valeria reached the village and began the evacuation, her flying became even more impressive. She was landing in spaces barely large enough for her aircraft, loading civilians under enemy fire, and taking off again with overloaded weight that should have made flight impossible. How was she flying that thing with that many people aboard, Martinez wondered, watching radar tracks that showed the helicopter carrying far more weight than normal operational limits. But most impressive was her ability to navigate back through hostile territory while protecting her passengers. She was using terrain features, altitude changes, and evasive maneuvering that kept enemy forces from establishing effective firing solutions. Years later, Martinez would tell others, "Watching her work the controls through that wall of gunfire, I knew immediately. Those were the moves I had seen before, from Falcon Eyes, the legendary Kraken unit pilot who could navigate anything with rotors. The helicopter that touched down on the airfield was severely overloaded, carrying 42 civilians in an aircraft designed for far fewer passengers. Steam rose from the overworked engines, and bullet holes were visible throughout the fuselage, but everyone aboard was alive and uninjured." As the rescued civilians stumbled out of the helicopter, the crowd that had gathered erupted in celebration. People cheered, cried with relief, and embraced both the survivors and each other in spontaneous displays of joy and gratitude. "She did it!" someone shouted. "She actually pulled them all out!" The celebration continued as medical personnel moved in to check the evacuated civilians, while maintenance crews began examining Valeria's helicopter to assess the damage it had sustained during the rescue operation. But the jubilant atmosphere changed completely when military radio traffic crackled over the base communication system. "Unknown rescue helicopter, this is Raptor One," came the voice of an F-22 pilot who had been providing distant air cover during the evacuation. "Please identify yourself. We need confirmation of pilot identity." Valeria was climbing out of her helicopter, exhausted from the intense flying and hoping to blend back into the background now that the mission was complete. The last thing she wanted was official attention or recognition that might lead to questions about her background. "Rescue helicopter, please respond," the F-22 pilot continued. "Ground control is requesting pilot identification for mission debrief." Colonel Hayes, who had arrived to oversee the evacuation response, picked up a radio to respond on Valeria's behalf. "Raptor One, this is ground control. Rescue performed by civilian contractor helicopter." There was a pause before the F-22 pilot responded, and when he did, his voice carried a completely different tone. "Ground control, negative on civilian contractor. We observed flight patterns during the rescue operation. Request confirmation. Is pilot call sign Falcon Eyes?" The effect of that question on everyone within hearing range was immediate and profound. Falcon Eyes was a legendary call sign in military aviation circles, associated with some of the most daring and successful rescue operations in special operations history. Colonel Hayes stared at Valeria, who had gone very still beside her helicopter. "Ma'am, the F-22 pilot is asking if your call sign is Falcon Eyes. Is there something you need to tell us?" Before Valeria could respond, another voice joined the radio conversation. "Raptor 2 confirming. Flight patterns and tactical maneuvering consistent with Falcon Eyes' operational signature. Welcome back, ma'am." The crowd of celebrating civilians and military personnel fell silent as the implications of the radio exchange became clear. The quiet civilian contractor who had just performed an impossible rescue was apparently someone whose reputation was known to elite military pilots. "Falcon Eyes," Valeria said quietly, her voice barely audible over the helicopter engines that were still cooling down. "That was my operational call sign during my previous assignment." Colonel Hayes felt his understanding of the situation shift completely. "Previous assignment with what unit?" "Kraken Unit Special Aviation Operations," Valeria replied, pulling back the sleeve of her flight suit to reveal the silver bracelet she had kept hidden. I was a combat rescue pilot specializing in high-risk evacuations from hostile territory. The revelation sent shockwaves through everyone present. Kraken Unit was legendary for impossible missions accomplished under impossible circumstances. And Falcon Eyes was a name that had become synonymous with rescue operations that defied belief. Lieutenant Peters, who had laughed at her volunteer offer just hours before, looked physically ill. "Ma'am, we had no idea who you were. The things we said about your helicopter, about your qualifications." "You said what you believed based on what you could see," Valeria replied. "A civilian contractor with an old helicopter offering to fly a dangerous mission. You couldn't have known about my background because I chose not to share it." Captain Rodriguez approached her with obvious respect and embarrassment. "Ma'am, why hide your qualifications? With your experience and reputation, you could have any assignment you wanted in military aviation." Valeria looked back at the helicopter that had just carried 42 people to safety, its battle-scarred exterior hiding the precisely maintained systems that had made the rescue possible. "Because I lost my entire squadron during my last military operation," she said quietly. 12 aircraft and 36 crew members died following a mission plan I developed. When I came home, I decided I was done with military service. I wanted to save lives without wearing a uniform or carrying the weight of command decisions. The F-22 pilots continued their radio conversation, clearly moved by the opportunity to communicate with someone whose reputation had inspired their own service. "Falcon Eyes, for the record, today's mission was textbook perfect. 42 souls extracted under fire with 0 casualties. Outstanding work." "Thank you, Raptor One," Valeria replied. "But this wasn't about demonstrating technique. These were people who needed help, and I had the ability to provide it." Colonel Hayes was beginning to understand the profound implications of what had just occurred. "Ma'am, you've been working as a civilian contractor for 3 years, hiding the fact that you're one of the most decorated rescue pilots in military history." "I've been working as a civilian contractor because that allows me to focus on saving lives without the politics and command responsibilities that come with military service," Valeria corrected. Today was no different from any other rescue mission, except that more people were watching. The crowd of rescued civilians, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, began to understand that their rescue had been performed not just by a skilled pilot, but by someone whose legend had inspired stories throughout the military aviation community. One of the children who had been evacuated approached Valeria shyly. "Ma'am, are you famous?" Valeria knelt down to the child's eye level. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who knows how to fly helicopters, and today you needed a ride to safety. If you believe that legends sometimes choose silence while still carrying the entire sky, right, I owe a debt." As the immediate crisis passed and the rescued civilians were transported to medical facilities for evaluation, Valeria quietly began post-flight maintenance on her helicopter. Despite the celebration continuing around her, she wanted to return to the anonymity she had carefully maintained for 3 years. But the transformation in how others treated her was immediate and impossible to ignore. The same military personnel who had dismissed her as just a civilian contractor now approached her with obvious respect and curiosity about her hidden background. Lieutenant Peters, who had laughed at her mission volunteer offer, approached her as she was inspecting battle damage to her aircraft. "Ma'am, I need to apologize for everything I said earlier. We had no idea we were working alongside a legend." Valeria looked up from the bullet hole she was examining. "Lieutenant, you don't need to apologize for anything. You treated me based on my current assignment and apparent qualifications. I chose to hide my background because I wanted to serve without the expectations that come with my previous reputation." "But Falcon Eyes," Peters protested. "You're famous throughout military aviation. Why work as a contractor instead of accepting the recognition and assignments you've earned?" "Because recognition and prestigious assignments weren't what I needed after losing my squadron," Valeria replied, returning to her inspection work. I needed to serve in a way that focused on saving lives rather than building reputation or advancing career goals. Colonel Hayes found her later that afternoon, still performing maintenance tasks on her helicopter, despite offers from military maintenance crews to handle the repairs. Torres, I've been authorized to offer you a return to active duty with full reinstatement of rank and privileges. Your skills are clearly being wasted in civilian contractor work. Sir, with respect, my skills are being used exactly as I intended, Valeria said, continuing to work on engine components. Today, 42 people went home to their families because I was in a position to help them. That's exactly the kind of service I want to provide. Hayes studied her face, trying to understand someone who would choose civilian contractor work over prestigious military assignments. But your experience could save more lives if you were in an official capacity, leading rescue operations and training other pilots. Sir, I save lives every day by maintaining my aircraft properly, accepting dangerous missions that other contractors won't take, and being ready when people need help. That's the kind of service that works best for me now. That evening, alone in her quarters, Valeria opened a small metal box where she kept mementos from her military service. Inside was her Kraken unit patch, along with photographs of her squadron before their final mission. Miguel, Sarah, Jackson, she whispered to the faces in the photographs. Today I kept the promise. 42 people made it home safely. She carefully placed the photographs back in the box alongside her service decorations. I'm still flying, still bringing people home, just without the uniform and without making the decisions that could cost more lives. The next morning, Valeria reported for routine contractor duties exactly as she had every day for the past 3 years. Her helicopter showed fresh repairs from the previous day's battle damage, but otherwise, she appeared to be the same quiet civilian pilot who handled supply runs and occasional evacuations. The rescued villagers had left messages thanking their mysterious pilot, and someone had painted Falcon Eyes. She saved us on the wall near her helicopter parking area. Type, I will live kindly if you believe that humility is the truest form of glory. This isn't just a story about a helicopter rescue or hidden military credentials, or the moment when someone's concealed expertise saves dozens of lives. This is about something much more fundamental. The way we judge people based on their current roles without understanding the complexity of their experiences, their choices, and their reasons for being where they are. How many Valeria Torres are working and supporting roles around you right now? How many people have you encountered who seem to be in positions that don't match their apparent capabilities, who display unusual competence or knowledge that goes beyond what their current jobs require? We live in a culture that often assumes someone's current position represents the peak of their achievements and qualifications. We see someone in a contractor role and assume they lack the credentials for more prestigious work. We see someone performing routine tasks and assume they've never held positions requiring advanced skills or leadership. But people's career paths are complex, and the reasons someone chooses a particular role often have nothing to do with their limitations. Sometimes the most qualified individuals are those who have experienced the weight of high-level responsibility and chosen to serve in ways that don't require making life-and-death decisions for others. Valeria chose civilian contract work not because she couldn't handle military assignments, but because she had handled the most demanding military assignments possible and decided that supporting rescue operations was more meaningful than leading them. She had saved countless lives as a military pilot, lost an entire squadron due to a mission plan she developed, and chosen to honor their memory by continuing to save lives without seeking recognition or career advancement. The story also reminds us that expertise often chooses to serve quietly rather than prominently. Valeria's beat-up helicopter was actually a precisely maintained rescue aircraft. Her civilian contractor status was a deliberate choice, not a limitation. Her willingness to accept dangerous missions came from confidence born of extensive combat experience, not desperation for work. The F-22 pilots who recognized her call sign understood something that the ground personnel had missed. True legends often choose to disappear, rather than capitalize on their reputations. They serve because service matters to them, not because they need recognition or validation from others. Tomorrow, pay attention to the people around you who seem to be in supporting roles but display unusual competence or dedication. Notice those who volunteer for difficult tasks that others avoid. Observe the individuals who seem to understand complex situations with remarkable clarity. Maybe they're veterans applying military experience to civilian careers. Maybe they're former executives who chose less stressful positions. Maybe they're experts who discovered that the most meaningful work involves helping others rather than building personal legacies. The next time you're tempted to judge someone's capabilities based on their current job title or the condition of their equipment, remember Valeria Torres and the F-22 pilots who knew her name. Remember that sometimes the most powerful protection comes from the most unexpected sources, and that legends don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just quietly do the work that needs to be done. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to NL Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.